We are ready to begin, I believe. All right. Well, it is my pleasure and my honor to be the facilitator for this Doc Colloquium. And this happens to be our last one for this academic year. So it is particularly fun to be the one to send everyone off into the new year almost. So I want to welcome you to the colloquium. I'm Dr. Joy Phillips. I'm an associate clinical professor in the School of Ed, and I'm super pleased to have everyone here in attendance. We'll probably have other people continuing to join us as we get underway. So as many of you may be familiar, but not all, this Doctoral Student Colloquium series is an opportunity that we provide to our School of Education doctoral students to share their original research and to get feedback from peers and from faculty. So each month, one PhD student and one EDD student presents their research, and we are doing it fully online since COVID has intervened. So this is a really great opportunity for these students to get feedback on their developing research or their completed research. So each presenter will have approximately 20 minutes to provide an overview of their research. And following that, we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and answers for each candidate. So to begin with, our first speaker is a PhD student in the School of Education, Mathew. She's a second-year PhD student in the Educational Leadership and Policy stream. She holds an undergraduate degree in psychology and linguistics from the University of British Columbia and a master's in child study and education from the University of Toronto. Prior to her doctoral studies, she worked as an elementary school teacher and leader in Toronto, Vancouver, and Philadelphia. Her research interests are centered on educating for creative thinking in early childhood and K-12 context. And today she is presenting her research on the influence of feedback on creativity. She is working with Dr. Jen Katz-Bonin-Controw. So I'm going to mute myself. I invite everybody to mute themselves so we can kind of cut down on extra noise. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Dr. Phillips, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me just get my screen set up here. All right, so as Dr. Phillips said, today I'm going to be presenting my research, which focuses on educating for creativity. And specifically, I'll be speaking about the influence of creativity on creative self-beliefs and creative performance. This is research that I'm conducting in collaboration with my supervising professor, Dr. Jen Katz-Bonin-Controw, and two researchers from outside the School of Ed, Dr. Lila Krisiku and Dr. Richard Haas. And I want to acknowledge their intellectual contributions and work on this project up front. The study that I will present today is a part of a research agenda that moves from this experimental-based study to naturalistic studies. And I'm hoping to be able to use the results of this experiment that I'm going to present today to inform a quasi-experimental classroom study, which will be the basis of my dissertation. So as an overview of what I'm going to present today, I will present the problem and purpose of the study, some important definitions guiding this study, the conceptual framework which frames this research, a review of the prior literature in the area of feedback and creativity. Then I'll present the experimental study. I'll talk about some preliminary results from the study. I'll talk about some implications for research and practice. And finally, I'll briefly touch upon how this fits into my own dissertation research, some references, and at the end, I'm hoping there'll be time for questions, and I would very much welcome your feedback. So in terms of the problem guiding this study, educators need concrete guidance on how to teach for creativity. In recent years, as curriculums around the world have begun to emphasize competencies alongside content, educators have been increasingly tasked with developing students' learning competencies, such as creative thinking. One of the leverageable elements of the learning environment that teachers can manage is how they structure feedback, and there may be an opportunity for teachers to improve the feedback environment to ameliorate student creativity. However, within the creativity literature, there have been mixed results on the influence of feedback on creativity, and there's a lack of understanding on how individual beliefs about creativity mediate the relationship. The purpose of this experimental study is to elucidate the influence of feedback on creativity and explore how individual beliefs about creativity mediate the relationship. There are multiple definitions of creativity used by researchers and lay people alike. So fundamental to any study of creativity is establishing the definition for the purposes of the study. So in this case, we use Amabile's definition, which is that creativity is the ability to generate novel and appropriate ideas and products. Beliefs about creativity denote a person's beliefs about their own creativity and include beliefs on their ability to be creative, whether they consider creativity to be learnable or an inborn trait, and if they consider creativity to be a desirable trait for career or educational success, for example. Feedback here is defined as a response to a learner's task performance, which is intended to support the learner's cognition, motivation, or behavior. As a framework to guide our understanding of the relationship between feedback and creativity, we draw upon social learning theory from Albert Bandura. In this framework, environmental factors, personal factors, and behavior are in system. Specifically in relation to this study, the environmental factor we are focusing on is the nature of feedback. The personal factor which feedback interacts with is beliefs about creativity, and ultimately the behavior that we are interested in is creative performance. So to dive deeper into the nature of feedback, this is a complex concept. Many learning theorists consider feedback to be a key element of the learning process, and feedback has been studied widely in the field of education. On this slide are various characteristics of feedback which could be studied with respect to their effect on learning. Here in the middle level, I've input various personal factors that may mediate the effect of feedback on learning. Several of these characteristics of feedback and personal factors have been studied in relation to creativity, but lucky for me, there are still frontiers here to be explored. With respect to this study, which I will be presenting today, we looked at a very basic element of feedback, which was the valence. And valence indicates whether the feedback has an overall positive or an overall negative tone. Literature on the influence of feedback valence on creativity is mostly founded upon experimental laboratory studies. The results from these studies can be organized on a continuum of negative feedback to positive feedback, which is here on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, the outcome variable, which is creativity, ranges from higher levels of creativity and lower levels of creativity. So general trends in this research show that in general, feedback that yields higher creativity across the experiments has positive valence, is informative, and originates from a source who is perceived to have some expertise, such as a supervisor or a teacher. Feedback that yields lower creativity in these studies tends to have a negative valence and has a controlling nature. In a more neutral territory, this is an interesting finding that the mere anticipation of feedback yields slightly higher creativity than no anticipation of feedback. So in other words, people seem to like getting feedback, especially if it's positive. Although there are these general trends, there are some unexpected findings that appear in the literature. For example, Lee found that if students' epistemic motivation was primed, negative affective tone from the teacher actually yielded higher levels of creativity. Similarly, Kaufman and Vosberg found that when they primed for negative affect, they actually got higher creative performance. And then another interesting study by Katzman and Contro and others found that the mere presence of the instructor even if they conveyed encouragement to the learner, was constraining for creative thinking. So overall, there is some uncertainty in the literature on the nature of the influence of feedback valence on creativity. And certainly there's a need for fine-tuning this relationship for education. So in order to elucidate the relationship between feedback valence and creativity, we decided to replicate a previous study done by Zhu here, which showed that the effect that when given fake positive feedback, participants demonstrated higher creativity versus fake negative feedback, which resulted in lower creativity. We wanted to try to replicate these results using updated creativity tasks and scoring techniques, and also to explore whether differences in beliefs about creativity would mediate this relationship. Our research questions were thus: what is the influence of feedback valence on the novelty and appropriateness of individuals' creative responses on standard creativity tasks? And how does feedback interact with individual difference measures of creative achievement and beliefs about creativity? So the experiment included 2 measures of individual difference, which were beliefs about creativity, which measures creative self-efficacy, fixed and growth-mindedness, and the desirability of creativity. And also we used the individual creative activities and achievements measure, which measures people's real-life engagement in creative activities. We also included 2 different creativity tasks. The first was a creative problem-solving task where participants had to write a solution to a social problem. And the second was a divergent thinking task where participants had to generate as many ideas as they could for alternate uses for a common object. And this in this case, we used a brick. So these 2 creative tasks were scored using the consensual assessment technique, which includes rating by 2 independent raters who rate the responses on the dimensions of novelty and appropriateness. And this yields an overall creative performance score. Finally, I skipped too far ahead. Finally, and importantly, we included a manipulation in the experiment. So half of our participants were assigned to positive feedback after completing the first creativity task, and they received a positive message which said, you scored in the 80th percentile, you have strong creative potential that can be developed. And half of our participants were assigned to negative feedback, where they received a message that said, you scored in the 20th percentile, some people are born more creative than others, and the scores indicate that your creative potential might be underdeveloped. And I will just say that we debriefed very heavily within this experiment to let people know that this was fake feedback in the end. So in terms of our participants, they were undergraduate students who were enrolled in psychology courses, and they were given 2 extra credits in their course for their participation in the research. In terms of design, participants began by completing the individual differences measures, and then they started with a creativity task. They then received feedback according to the condition to which they were randomly assigned and completed a second creative task and a second round of feedback. So importantly here, our dependent variable of interest was their creative performance on this second task after receiving feedback. And we ended up conducting sort of the same design across 2 studies. I won't go too far into detail here about why we conducted 2 studies, but the first study took place in October 2019 to February 2020 and was laboratory based, and we had 65 participants. We then adapted it to a Qualtrics platform and were able to get 213 participants for the second study. And I just will note also that we feel really lucky and proud that we were able to continue this line of research during the pandemic. So we are in the process of analyzing the data from the second study, which will show a more complete picture of the influence of feedback on creativity across a greater number of participants. But here I'll show you the preliminary results from study 1, which included 65 participants. Although this is a small participant number, a power analysis determined that this sample size established sufficient power to detect the effects of feedback. In terms of the influence of feedback on creative novelty, Table 1 shows that none of the models, including gender, task order, and feedback valence, produced a significant R-squared change. The full model explained only 5% of the variance in novelty scores. And you can see here in Figure 2 that novelty scores following negative and positive feedback were nearly identical, and these differences did not reach statistical significance. In terms of the influence of feedback on appropriateness, Table 2 shows that the addition of feedback valence in the model significantly improved R-square value from 0.03 to 0.12, and the full model explains 15% of the variance in appropriateness scores. And also overall, we can see in Figure 2 that there is a statistically significant difference in appropriateness scores following negative and positive feedback, where positive feedback yielded higher creative appropriateness, particularly after completing the divergent thinking task. The difference in these two means is proportional to Zoo's results, which we were replicating or trying to replicate, and is in alignment with other previous literature that indicates that positive feedback enhances creative performance. Of note, however, is that the effect of positive feedback was only found for appropriateness and not for novelty. Also, the magnitude of difference between positive and negative feedback is different based on the creativity task. And so that is part of the reason why we designed the second study, to try to clarify what if the difference in the tasks was related to the perception of feedback. For exploratory purposes, correlations among individual difference measures and the novelty and appropriateness scores after feedback were examined. Interestingly, one of our individual difference measures, the individual creative activities and achievements, did not yield any significant correlations. The only significant correlation that resulted was between the desirability of creativity and novelty after feedback. This suggests a small but potentially interesting tendency for those who believe creativity to be a desirable trait to produce higher novelty after feedback. And this finding is consistent with Sanson's finding, which suggests that individuals who value creativity more highly may be more susceptible to the effects of feedback on their creative performance. In terms of implications for these preliminary results, for research, this study has shown that feedback may have a differential effect on creative appropriateness compared to novelty. In this study, we showed that appropriateness was significantly influenced by feedback, but novelty was not. When people rated creativity more highly as a desirable trait, we found a significant effect of feedback. Whereas those who rated the desirability of feedback or of creativity as lower, they were less influenced by feedback. We're currently analyzing study 2 to clarify how different creative task types impact the relationship between feedback and creativity. For practice, this study suggests that educators can increase the appropriateness of students' creative performance by offering positive informational feedback on their creative performance. Also, if students see creativity as an important learning competency and a desirable career and education skill, they will value feedback on their creative work more highly. And I think this has implications for educators as they transition to competency-based curriculums where they are explicitly trying to foster students' creative thinking competency. And this is where I'm hoping to make my contribution with my dissertation. In terms of my own dissertation plans, my end goal is to generate research that guides educators in how to structure classroom feedback that supports creative performance and creative self-beliefs. The next step of this research is to conduct naturalistic studies that situates the influence of feedback on creativity within the classroom. I would like to again acknowledge my supervising professor, Dr. Jen Katz-Van-Encontro, and our two collaborators, Dr. Leela Krisiku and Dr. Richard Haas. Thank you also to my classmates, colleagues, and professors who have viewed many iterations of this work and have provided effective informational feedback. To Jamina and Eric for their seamless organization of the Doctoral Colloquium month after month, and of course, my family. Here are some references, and I would very much welcome your questions and feedback.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Katie, for that outstanding presentation. And now we have 10 minutes on the button for questions, reactions, responses. I see that Katie has offered some considerations for possible feedback, but I'm pretty sure she's not limiting herself to those. So who would like to go first? Everybody's thinking. I have a question for you, Katie, actually. So when you're talking about negative feedback, this may be way beyond your study, but when you're talking about negative feedback, how does that compare to constructive feedback?
That's a really great question. To me, like, I think this is maybe more along the whether it's an informational type of feedback. So I would view like perhaps constructive feedback may have sort of a negative connotation. However, if it's delivered in an informational way, that sort of makes it a bit more helpful. But I haven't seen any specific research that sort of structures like constructive feedback on creativity. So that could be an interesting avenue.
Absolutely, thank you. Lots of applause in the chat.
Thank you, everyone.
I can offer a quick question if that's all right.
Sure.
Great job, wonderful presentation. Such a fascinating study you were working on. And I have a quick, maybe you could elaborate this, and you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation, but talking about the change in appropriateness and how it was improved with the feedback, could you give us any specific examples of what that looked like? And when you say the appropriateness altered a little bit, maybe just a little bit more detail on what that is, what that looks like.
Sure. So when we talk about appropriateness, in creativity, we talk about how well the response aligns to the prompt. So whether it's an appropriate use for the object. So for example, in the brick task, you could have responses such as bricks can be used for building houses, which is, appropriate, but not very novel. You could have responses such as for building a garden pathway, which again is appropriate and slightly more novel. Or you could have responses such as bricks can be used for heating in the sun to cook your scrambled eggs, which to me is appropriate and also very novel. So I think that's what we're thinking about in terms of appropriateness. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why we might be seeing this effect of how feedback is tuning appropriateness is because when a participant receives feedback, the idea or the concept of the audience is sort of brought into the light. And so they think, okay, well, I can be novel, but my responses shouldn't be so wild because someone is receiving this response and sort of evaluating it. So there's sort of the idea of the audience is brought into their mind. So that's just kind of a conjecture that I'm making about why we might be seeing that result. But we'll need to do some more investigation there, I think.
Dr. Vera Lee has posted a question in the chat. Dr. Lee, do you want to say it out loud, or you want me to read it?
Yeah, just Katie, that was a wonderful presentation, and yeah, just so polished, and just it was wonderfully presented. Just wondering, with your future dissertation work, you had mentioned wanting to do some classroom-based, school-based research. Are you thinking of perhaps some additional qualitative methods for capturing some of the data? Just wondering what your thought process is around wanting to capture some of some of the research with actual students and in this, I guess you refer to as more of a naturalistic setting.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for the question. Yes, I would absolutely like to conduct a mixed methods classroom, quasi-experimental classroom study with a convergent design. So collecting quantitative and qualitative data alongside one another. And I think that there is a real gap here in terms of how we can translate these results for educational settings. Because most of this research has been done in experimental settings. And so taking it to the classroom, I think it's important to include that qualitative dimension, sort of to capture the full experience of what's happening in natural settings. So I'm really excited to like, hopefully do that for my dissertation.
May I offer also congratulations just on really the clear and precise way that you're able to present fairly complex information and fairly complex in terms of data analysis, especially given that we have one smaller study underway and the other one already completed. I wanted to offer a couple ideas. So when Vera was asking about a qualitative component, one thing you can do with experimental research is you can have students talk out loud after, either during a task or after a task, and that might be an interesting component to extend this type of research that would fit very naturally with sort of doing the task, and then also working with teachers to create the type of task in the curriculum. That would also be a great component to extend it. So that's not too uncommon. That could be a fairly good fit, you know, with this and working with students. That would be wonderful to see. And then the other comment I just wanted to make is that in creativity research, mostly it's quantitative. And one of the issues with the recent development of theories of creativity over the past probably 20, 25 years in looking at schools is a lot of people haven't tested out a lot of these models. There's a lot of writing on, you know, mini-C creativity, and there's a lot of writing on how creativity should be important in classrooms, but there's not a lot of research really just to see how it plays out. And that's why we wanted to do an experimental design first, just to isolate down the conditions, the order of the tasks, and clarify the relationships, and then take the results to translate it to a classroom study. So I think there's so much work that can be done.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm particularly excited to be in this crossover of creativity and education, and particularly with the changes in curriculum. So I'm from Canada, and there's definitely been curriculum reform in the past sort of 5 years, which is really aimed at increasing student creativity and other core competencies. So I think it's a really interesting emerging area, and is going to hopefully have importance down the line. So thank you, Jen, for your suggestions.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one more question or comment.
I put a comment in the chat, but I'll share it with everyone, that I really appreciated your graphical visualization of the different literature on the topic. You know, being in your cohort, I've been following your work throughout all of this, and it was confusing when you first explained it, and then having that visual really illustrates it very nicely for people who aren't in the same area of focus. So
thank you. Judy.
Thank you. So I do have one last question. So your background is in early childhood, right? But the work you're doing with this that you've described is with young adults. And you talked about wanting to provide guidance to teachers as you move forward and past the program. So is it your hope to cover the whole spectrum of K-12, or take it back to early childhood, or?
That's a really good question. So my background is in elementary, so it's sort of like spanning up to kind of 7th grade. But yeah, I think like this sort of area is more within like high school or even undergraduate level. It's perhaps a little bit more relevant at this moment. But yeah, I'm hoping that those sort of two paths will meet at some point. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent work you're doing. And I know that we all send you best wishes as you move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips.
So for our next presenter, we have Sasha Alina Ortiz, who I believe is now Dr. Sasha Alina Ortiz. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
You just defended her dissertation
I did.
a week or so or less ago. She's worked in higher education in various capacities for over 10 years, serving primarily at-risk and underserved minority student populations. Currently, she serves as the campus director for the Pathways to Student STEM Success program at CUNY, Lehman College. And she has presented at several national conferences, including the most recent 34th annual conference for the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. Her research interests entail exploring how positive psychological theories and concepts can influence retention and persistent strategies for first-generation minority STEM students. Her bio says she is pursuing, but she has pursued successfully, an EDD in educational leadership and management with a concentration in learning technologies at Drexel University. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology with a minor in Religious Studies from Swarthmore, and her Master of Science in Higher Education with a concentration in Global and International Education, also from Drexel. And she is working with Dr. Michael Kozak as your supervising professor. So again, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ortiz.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Can everybody hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yes, thank you, Dr. Phillips, for that introduction. I am a doctor and it's surreal and it hasn't quite sunk in yet. I'm waiting for the moment that it does. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sasha Ortiz, and I currently serve as the campus's director for a STEM support program that spans 3 community colleges in the Bronx. And as Dr. Phillips mentioned, I work primarily with minority and first generation students, which is how I became interested in this topic. So today I will be presenting my dissertation research study, which is titled How High Achieving First Generation STEM Students Persevere and Succeed in College. And it is a mixed method study on the non-cognitive constructs, experiences and resources that promote academic success for first generation STEM students. And I do want to thank Dr. Michael Kozak very quickly for all of the support and assistance that he's provided throughout this process. So to provide a brief overview, I will be first addressing the problem that this study addresses, the purpose of the research, my research questions, the significance of the research, the study's conceptual framework, the research methodology and limitations, the findings and conclusions, and finally, the implications for practice and future research. So the problem that guided the study is the reality that degree completion rates are significantly lower for first generation students when compared to graduation rates for traditional students. And this is especially for those that are pursuing STEM degrees. And as of 2018, the graduation rate for first generation STEM students was only 16%. And the purpose of this study was to examine the effects that grit, growth mindset, and self-regulation have on academic achievement and degree completion for first-generation STEM college students, and also to explore the experiences and resources that help them overcome challenges and complete their STEM degrees. So 3 research questions guided this study, and the first was, is there a significant difference in the academic performance and degree completion rates of first-generation STEM students who exhibit high levels of grit, growth mindset, and self-regulation when compared to those who exhibit lower levels? Second research question was, do grit, growth mindset, and self-regulation predict academic performance and degree completion rates for first-generation STEM college students? And third, what experiences and resources help first-generation STEM students overcome challenges and persevere to degree completion? There were 4 primary reasons why this research is significant. First, there's a limited amount of research that addresses high-achieving first-generation students and their experiences, especially how it pertains to perseverance. Next, the study serves to challenge the deficit model that traditionally informs programs at colleges and universities, which typically focus on the deficiencies and what this population may be lacking. However, it's important to understand how these students succeed so that we can encourage and promote these factors as well. Third, it's important for first-generation students to experience success and graduate from college so that they have a better chance at upward mobility. And finally, it has significant implications for colleges and universities because increased graduation rates can equate to increased access to funding and more opportunities and resources to address student needs. To review the conceptual framework, and this will be brief, there were 3 streams of literature, and the first stream focused on characteristics of first-generation college students, and this included barriers to their success in higher education, as well as factors that have shown to contribute to their success in higher education. The second stream focused on programs and interventions that have been implemented across colleges and universities to encourage success for first-generation students. And the third stream explored the role of 3 specific non-cognitive constructs in academic achievement. And these were Angela Duckworth's seminal work on grit, Carolyn Dweck's mindset theory, and Albert Bandura's seminal work on self-regulation. This was a convergent mixed method study, and I chose this study because it allowed me to identify the non-cognitive traits associated with high-achieving first-generation STEM students through the quantitative data, while using the qualitative data to kind of contextualize how these constructs manifested in the strategies, experiences, and resources that help them overcome their challenges and succeed in their STEM degree programs. So this research study was conducted using first-generation STEM students from 2 community colleges that are a part of the City University of New York college system. The first site was Lehman College, which is a 4-year community college in the Bedford Park area of the Bronx. And the second site was Hostos Community College, which is a 2-year community college in the South Bronx. The population for this study was identified using purposeful sampling and consisted of 1,336 first-generation STEM students who were enrolled during the 2019 through 2021 academic years. 1,058 were from Lehman and 278 were from Hostos. For the quantitative component of this study, I used the grit S scale, or the short grit scale, to measure grit, the implicit theories of intelligence scale to measure growth mindset. The short self-regulation questionnaire was used to measure self-regulation. I received 160 valid responses, which were used to analyze the survey data. And then I also obtained data on the GPAs and semesters enrolled through graduation from the Offices of Institutional Research at each respective college. Once all the data was collected, I used Qualtrics to score the surveys, and then SPSS to run the ANOVA linear regression and Pearson's correlation analyses to specifically address the first 2 research questions. For the qualitative segment, I conducted 60-minute semi-structured interviews with 10 high-achieving first-generation STEM students who were recommended for the study by administrators in the honors colleges, accelerated programs, and STEM support programs. And all interviews were conducted through Zoom due to the pandemic, and they were audio and video recorded. For the data analysis, I used MaxQDA, which is a qualitative coding program, and I established the first cycle codes using in vivo process, emotion, value, and descriptive coding strategies, because I felt like those coding strategies really aligned with what I was seeking to get from the third research question. For the second cycle coding process, I examined the frequency, patterns, and themes among the first cycle codes, and then established the final themes and sub-themes that informed the study's findings. So before I go into the findings, there were several limitations to the study. First, all of the surveys are self-reported surveys, so they assume that the participants are answering truthfully. Second, the COVID-19 pandemic presented several limitations, which included access to reliable internet, access to private spaces to be interviewed, and availability due to illness or taking care of an ill household member. So now I'll go into the findings and I'll discuss the quantitative findings first, followed by the qualitative findings. So of the 160 respondents, 56% were female and 44% were male. The sample primarily identified as Hispanic or Black or African American, which is an accurate representation of the ethnic backgrounds of Lehman and Hostos, which are both Hispanic serving institutions. To address the first research question, I ran a series of one-way ANOVA analyses, and as it pertained to grit, results revealed that GPA was significantly different for students with low grit scores compared to students with high grit scores, where grit accounted for 13% of the variance in GPA, which is a medium effect size according to Cohen. I mean, as you can see in this chart, I ran a post hoc Tukey test, and the only group that did not have showed a significant difference were the GPAs between the students who exhibited average levels of grit and those that exhibited high levels of grit. Relative to degree completion, there were no significant differences in the time to degree completion for students with low grit compared to those with high grit. The results for mindset were similar to grit, where the ANOVA revealed that GPA was significantly different for first-generation STEM students with fixed mindsets compared to those with borderline and growth mindsets, where 10.7% of the variance in GPA was accounted for by mindset, which is a small to medium effect size. And as per degree completion, again, there was no significant difference across the mindset groups. Relative to self-regulation, the quantitative findings indicated that there was no significant difference in GPA or time to degree completion between any of the self-regulation groups. Next, I used a linear regression analysis to address the second research question, which asked about the predictive relationship between the non-cognitive constructs and GPA and degree completion. And the results indicated that mindset and grit slightly significantly predicted GPA, although the effect sizes were small. I also ran a multiple linear regression to examine the interaction effect of all three non-cognitive constructs on GPA and degree completion. And the multiple linear regression model indicated that grit, mindset, and self-regulation collectively significantly predicted GPA. 10% of the variance in GPA was accounted for by that interaction. And it also significantly predicted degree completion, where 7.4% of the variance in how long it took the students to graduate was accounted for by the interaction effect of the non-cognitive constructs. And finally, I ran a Pearson's correlation to observe the relationship between the non-cognitive constructs. And this analysis really emerged after I performed the qualitative analyses. Many of the stories from the qualitative analysis indicated an interplay between these constructs, especially between grit and self-regulation. So I wanted to test these relationships in my sample. And the correlation analysis showed a moderately positive correlation between grit and mindset, which actually reflects what's indicated in the literature, and also mindset and self-regulation. However, the strongest correlation emerged between grit and self-regulation, which suggests that while statistical analyses did not find that self-regulation itself had a significant impact on academic achievement or degree completion, it may play a significant role in the perseverance strategies that gritty students employ. And this quantitative finding also supports the qualitative findings that I will discuss in this next section. So 4 significant themes and sub-themes emerged from the qualitative analysis. The first theme was that students perceived that their personal challenges exacerbated their academic challenges. And 3 primary sub-themes emerged relative to the personal challenges that they perceived impacted academics. So first, 6 of the 10 participants were immigrants who came to the United States without speaking English. And they all shared that the transition to a new country and a new academic culture without speaking English was a serious challenge for them. One of the participants who immigrated a year before starting college shared how not just learning English was a challenge, but learning how to apply it in the academic setting was almost even more challenging. And he said, I understand the concepts. I cannot express my thoughts correctly. I cannot articulate what I'm trying to say in class. I had to translate everything before I say something, and it was really hard for me. But I didn't want that to hold me back, even though I felt like I should give up and go back to my country. Next, all participants shared that they balanced multiple responsibilities due to family and financial circumstances. All 10 had part-time or full-time jobs to help support their parents or children, and shared how prioritizing school over work was a challenge. For example, a second participant shared that she came with her family from Mexico. Her mother's a stay-at-home parent and her father's a full-time line cook. And she shared, we got evicted, so I had to help my dad with the bills. And that's the first time I started working. It was freshman year, and my job was all the way on the other side of the Bronx. I had to take a train and then take either a bus or walk. It's an hour and 30 minutes away, so I didn't really have time to study, and my GPA suffered. The third and final challenge that resonated among participants was the lack of instrumental support from parents. Participants shared that the college application and transition process was difficult because their parents could not impart any knowledge or advice since they lacked this experience. So for example, one quote was, I had my friends being like, oh, my parents helped me out with the FAFSA, but I had to do the FAFSA. I had to do my own FAFSA because my parents can't read English. So I had to do it all by myself. And another area relative to lack of instrumental support that emerged was that participants shared that it's a struggle getting their parents to understand the demands and expectations of college, especially how they differ from K through 12 or the K through 12 equivalent in their respective countries. So participant 9, who was from Africa, shared that in her country, it's customary to have large family gatherings on a regular basis. And her family couldn't understand when she could not participate. And she actually noted that remote learning during the pandemic allowed her to kind of sit her family in front of the computer and say, this is what this is what I'm learning. This is what the professor expects from me. And now they have a better understanding, and they kind of given her some slack a little bit. So relative to the challenges, all 10 participants shared the ways that they've been challenged during the pandemic. And the primary challenges that emerged were a lack of privacy or space to study, a lack of reliable internet. Many of the students shared that they struggled with the virtual delivery of STEM courses, particularly with lab courses. And they battled with social media distractions because it was the main mode of social interaction during this time. And they felt like they had a lack of emotional support due to social isolation. The second theme that emerged was that high-achieving first-generation STEM students regularly utilize campus resources. And the resources that were mentioned included the writing and tutoring centers, the library, student clubs, and a Pathways to Student STEM Success program. And specific to that program, participants shared that access to research and internship experiences and the overall sense of community that the program fostered were most beneficial. The participants did note that colleges did not make it easy for them to access these resources during the pandemic, and over time, their motivation kind of waned due to this difficulty. Also, all 10 participants shared the benefit of having peer and faculty mentors in STEM to fill their knowledge gaps. But more importantly, they stressed that it's super important for them that these mentors not only look like them from a racial ethnic standpoint, but also overcame similar challenges and can kind of share shared experiences. Theme 3 strongly resonated with Duckworth's definition of grit, which she defined as passion and perseverance toward long-term goals, where passion equates to sustained interest. And participants throughout their interviews frequently stressed that it was a combination of their interest in STEM and their sense of purpose that motivated them to persist through the challenges and complete their STEM degrees. So, for example, one of the participants shared a quote, I wanted to be a pediatrician since 11th grade. I want to be a pediatrician, even if it takes time, even if it takes like 20 years for me to be a pediatrician, then I'll be a 50-year-old pediatrician. I don't care. I'm going to do it. And I really felt like that quote resonated with Dr. Relative to their sense of purpose and what drives them to persevere, participants shared their desire for a better future for themselves and their families was a motivating factor. They reside in low-income households in some of the poorest districts in New York City, and shared how their financial struggles have not just shaped their college experiences, but overall their goals. So they shared that the primary motivation was to escape poverty. And one quote from a participant was, "I literally lived in a car with my kids. That was before I decided to go back to school. Now I'm with my parents because I had to move from our apartment during the pandemic. I just don't want to worry about this anymore. I want a better future for myself, but I want a better future for my kids more." Another primary motivation was honoring the sacrifices of their parents. So as I previously noted, 6 participants immigrated to the United States with their parents and described their parents as people who sacrificed a lot to give them a better future. And a lot of these students share that they're motivated to kind of give back to their parents for that sacrifice. So participant 4, who immigrated from Mexico, said, "They came here with nothing and they did their best so I can have a better future. We moved around a lot and never had much, and I want to see that their sacrifice wasn't for nothing." Theme 4, effort over intelligence, really aligns with Dweck's mindset theory. Dweck asserts that individuals with a growth mindset believe that their skills and abilities can be developed with effort and that their intelligence is changeable. All 10 participants shared the belief that they are capable of success regardless of their academic or personal challenges, as long as they continue to work hard. They continuously emphasized that they believed that they were intelligent, but it had nothing to do with that their success was a result of effort. The participants also regularly reframed their challenges as learning experiences. So for example, participant 1 said, "I don't like talking about shortcomings. They're not actually shortcomings. I think of them more like learned lessons. There's always somebody that has it worse, and there's always something to learn. So it's more important to be thankful for these lessons." And these convictions strongly align with having a growth mindset. I do think that it's important to note quickly that some of the participants felt like their intelligence decreased since beginning college, and these perceptions were based on exam or course grades that they received. And this just shows the ways that metrics based on fixed systems can have a negative impact on individuals' mindsets because there's an incongruency in the messaging that they're receiving. So once the quantitative and qualitative results were triangulated, 5 results emerged. Result number 1, high achieving first generation STEM students are gritty, and that's a term that Duckworth uses to describe students with high grit. And grit manifested as perseverance driven by a sustained personal interest in STEM and the desire to escape poverty and honor their parents. Result number 2 is that high achieving first generation students possess growth mindsets, which was primarily demonstrated by their emphasis on hard work over intelligence and the way they perceive their challenges. Result number 3 was that self-regulation did not increase GPA, but was important in perseverance. So the quantitative analysis indicated that self-regulation was not significant. However, the students reported us using self-regulatory strategies when they were coping with stress, managing their responsibilities, and in completing short-term goals. Result number 4 was that other factors matter and may matter more relative to academic achievement. So although the study's findings showed a significant and predictive relationship between the non-cognitive constructs, well, between grit and growth mindset and GPA, it's important to acknowledge that the effect sizes were small to moderate, which suggests that other variables may play a more considerable role and are worth exploring. And finally, result number 5 was that findings indicated that none of the non-cognitive constructs examined in this study had a significant effect on how many semesters it took first-generation STEM students to graduate. And this result may be due to the smaller sample size that was used to examine the effects of grit, mindset, and self-regulation on degree completion. So of the 160 surveys returned, only 75 of those participants had graduated. So very quickly, the findings of this study support several implications for practice. So it's important to help first-generation students identify STEM interests early in their education and then nurture these interests through high school. Additionally, it's important for first-generation STEM students or first generation students with STEM interests to develop cultural capital, which includes developing an awareness of STEM careers and understanding of what these paths entail, as well as prepping them for the academic rigor and cultural experiences of college. It's also important for colleges and universities to help first generation STEM students identify and effectively express what their interests are, how these interests align with STEM, why they're pursuing these STEM degrees, and what they want to do with these degrees after graduating. And so pre-college and early college programs may want to consider incorporating strategies for cultivating grit and mindset that have been shown to have positive effects in the literature. And these include self-explorative activities such as vision boards, self-evaluative activities such as interest and career assessments, and self-reflective assignments that really encourage the students to think about what they've discovered about themselves as a learner, their accomplishments, and how they continue to grow. Relative to language, since six out of the 10 participants shared that their most significant academic challenge was learning English and learning how to think critically in English in the context of their STEM courses, language immersion programs may want to consider contextualizing their curriculum to align with other disciplines in the college. Another significant theme was reframing negative experiences as opportunities for learning and growth. Therefore, first generation STEM students should be encouraged to think about the ways that they approach setbacks and failure and challenged to consider a variety of solutions to problems. And finally, the study revealed that the participants benefited from peer and faculty mentors who looked like them. So it's important for colleges and institutions to ensure that there's a diverse representation of STEM faculty that are willing to mentor and support minority first generation students. So based on the findings and conclusions of the study, future research is warranted in the area of degree completion. None of the non-cognitive constructs had a significant effect on how long it took the students to graduate. As I previously mentioned, the sample size for this segment was small, so future research may consider replicating this study with an increased sample size. Next, grit and growth mindset played a significant role in how the students persevered through setbacks while in college. And there's a considerable amount of research about the role these non-cognitive constructs play in academic performance, but a limited amount that explores the roles they may play in helping these students overcome challenges and persist in their degree programs. Additionally, future research may want to consider the interaction effects of several non-cognitive constructs relative to degree completion, since in this study, the interaction of grit, growth mindset, and self-regulation predicted degree completion where the individual constructs did not. And finally, this study revealed that grit and growth mindset, while significant, only explained the small to moderate increase in academic performance. So this suggests that other variables are important and warrant further research. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for being patient with it running a little bit over, and now I open it to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz, for that excellent study. Mixed method study. It was outstanding for both its breadth and its depth. Really appreciate that. So as she said, we're opening it up for questions or comments. And they're starting to flow into the chat. Lots of congrats.
Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
So a lot of the research with student retention talks about integration into the college community and the campus resources that you mentioned, utilizing those things. I'm wondering what you saw with the shift to virtual education and really those physical spaces to integrate with the community of the college being no longer available, how students navigated that.
So a lot of the students spoke at length about how the decreased access to not just those resources, but like I mentioned, the community that some of the resources promoted on campus, how it really affected their motivation. A lot of the students that you would see on campus who were highly motivated suddenly were considering withdrawing from all of their classes. And these were students that had, 4.0s, 3.5 GPAs. And I don't feel like they perceive that the colleges ever really grasp how to address that situation. There was one program that they mentioned, which was the Pathways to Success program that facilitated a lot of social events, like even if it was like watching a Netflix movie or having Kahoots where they would do these games online that tried to do something every other Friday. And they felt like that really helped. They also felt their peer mentors were a significant resource during that time because they felt like they at least had somebody to talk to about some of the challenges that they were facing during the pandemic. But honestly, in terms of accessing those resources, they never felt like that was resolved. One of the other feedback that I got from the students was that they kept changing the process to access these resources. So this was new to colleges and universities, just like it was to students. And so you try one thing, it's not working. You try another thing, it may be working a little better, but it was that made it even more cumbersome for these students.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really interesting research. Thank you.
Other comments? I see there's a question from Dr. Jen Katz. Would you like to ask it directly or would you like me to read it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for explaining this study. I really appreciated learning about actually how you combine the quantitative and the qualitative. And I was just wondering a couple of two small things. In terms of the STEM majors, I don't know if we saw the breakdown of the STEM majors. Like, did you notice, like, specifically, like, say, I don't know, like math or engineering, did you notice any patterns according to major? And then secondly, did you notice any patterns according to maybe how female students might have addressed the barriers, since a lot of people claim that, you know, female students might have more family obligations, for example, or different expectations placed on them from their family that may conflict with their educational aspirations, for example?
So in my defense presentation, I had a lot more time and many more slides. So I did not include the STEM breakdown. There were 13 STEM majors that were represented in the sample, very few engineering majors, most were biology and chemistry. But I ran an independent samples t-test across all of the demographic variables, just to see if there were differences in the grit mindset and self-regulation across those demographics, and there were no significant differences. So in terms of, you know, whether females had more grit than males, in my sample, there was no difference in by race or by gender or by STEM major. But in terms of the qualitative stories that were told, unfortunately, I had 3 males out of the 10 participants for the qualitative segment, and then the rest were females. And I did not pick up on a theme between the males and the females in terms of any significant differences in what they may have been experiencing. 2 out of the 3 males were parents, and 2 out of the 7 females were parents. And I did notice that both the males and females who had dependents felt extreme pressure to provide for their families. The females were single parents, the males were not. They were in relationships, but both of them were Uber drivers who said that they drove Uber through all hours of the night, just to be able to support their, provide support for their kids and attend school in the morning, and that was, really difficult for them. I think if I reflect back on the stories, the female participants had support from their parents, whereas the male participants did not. So I did get into discussions with them about whether childcare was an issue. And for those who didn't have children in school, they really relied on their parents to help provide that support. The male participants did not have that extra support. Or if does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so
Okay.
much. I was just wondering if there are any, additional stories, but
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you again. We've run slightly over, but I am happy that we've had such lovely discussion and conversation. I want to thank our two presenters again, Katie Mathew and Dr. Sasha Ortiz. You've both done excellent jobs. Also, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are at the end of the colloquium series for this academic year. The first Friday in October is when they are usually resumed, and that would be October the 1st. So you might want to save the date on your calendar and wait for an email that confirms that that is the actual date. But thank you all for attending. Happy Friday.